Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I have been asked by a longtime viewer and an individual whom I greatly respect to comment on the merits and on some of the weaknesses of the philosophy of objectivism. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the term, objectivism is the philosophy that was founded by Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a Russian-American novelist and philosopher who lived from 1905 to 1982. Really a brilliant person, a very keen, logical, analytical mind who has had an immense influence on American thinking, including in philosophy, politics, and even economics, as she helped popularize the works of such great Austrian economists as Ludwig von Mises. Ayn Rand, I believe, is an excellent gateway to philosophy. This is the first, and I think the most significant strength of the philosophy of objectivism. It really gets people interested in thinking, especially young people who might not be willing to pick up just any philosophical treatise that is published by an academician, be that academician someone who lived several centuries ago, or a professor who is writing today. Really, the interest and the passion that Ayn Rand displayed toward ideas, and the recognition that she had of the relevance of ideas and sound thinking and reason and logic to everyday human life, are phenomenal. And I believe these are takeaways that every person should assimilate into his or her approach toward the world. In terms of the actual content of the philosophy, a major strength is the way in which it integrates various concepts that have occurred in other thought systems before. Ayn Rand was once asked to describe objectivism while standing on one foot. And what she came up with was this. In metaphysics, objectivism stands for objective reality, objective truth. In epistemology, objectivism stands for the use of reason, the human faculty of reason being capable of comprehending and explaining the way the world works. In ethics, objectivism stands for rational egoism, or enlightened self-interest, with all things considered, and with the long term considered and not just the short term. What is good for you is actually also what is best for other people as well. As long as everybody is acting rationally, there's no possible conflict of interest. The conflict of interest only arises when there's irrationality or short-sightedness or failure to grasp some essential component of the truth. And in politics, Ayn Rand advocated free markets, the liberation of the human mind and the human productive ability to compete, to innovate, to produce, without the sorts of barriers that are often placed on innovation, without force being initiated against producers of value. So I think all of these are excellent concepts, and fundamentally they have my full agreement, and they have certainly appeared in other forms with other thinkers. The idea of an objective reality can be seen as early as the writings of Aristotle. The idea of reason in epistemology was one that drove the Enlightenment. The idea of enlightened self-interest also manifested itself in the writings of certain Enlightenment thinkers such as Voltaire. The idea of free markets, the ideas of individual rights, animated the writings of John Locke and Thomas Jefferson, and economists like Frederic Bastiat, Milton Friedman, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek. And certainly what we see is all of these writers focusing on certain aspects of this integration of ideas. But Ayn Rand did a remarkable job in presenting them all as a single structure, a kind of skeletal framework upon which I believe it is essential to continue adding elaborations and further extrapolations in the ongoing search for truth. Another very important strength of objectivism is its powerful expression. Ayn Rand thought of herself as a novelist first, and then as a philosopher, and she only really saw the need to write philosophical nonfiction in order to extend and elaborate upon the ideas that she presented in her novels such as Anthem, We the Living, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged. And whatever one thinks of particular elements of those novels, one cannot deny that Ayn Rand's literary style is tremendously gripping and powerful. This is one of the most popular philosophical writers of all time. There have been surveys which essentially placed Atlas Shrugged as second in terms of reader popularity after the Bible, and the Bible has had many thousands of years in order to acquire this sort of popularity, whereas Atlas Shrugged was only published in the late 1950s. And furthermore, a lot of the particular elements of the philosophy of objectivism are quite admirable. There is tremendous respect for productivity and for the human mind. The central premise of Atlas Shrugged is, what would happen if the people of extraordinary ability, the people of the mind, went on strike and just refused to put forth the voluntary efforts of their minds that have essentially advanced human civilization throughout history? What would happen? Societies would collapse. And indeed, this insistence that there is objective truth, there is an absolute reality, that it can be discoverable by human beings exerting rational effort, and that there is a right way to approach this and a wrong way to approach this, is very refreshing. It's refreshing because it provides a fundamental guidance. Philosophy doesn't so much provide particular answers to everyday problems, like how many hours a day should I exercise, or what should I eat for lunch tomorrow, or should I live in area X or area Y? But it does provide a kind of underlying framework, a way of thinking, a methodology that enables individuals to consider these kinds of decisions systematically. And objectivism is quite unwavering in this, which really helps people who take ideas seriously and reinforces a desire to find solutions, as opposed to existing in a kind of numbing intellectual fog. So with regard to the strengths of objectivism, there are many. And there would have been a time where I would have called myself an objectivist hands down. Now I have to qualify this, because there are shortcomings, in my view, to objectivism, at least as it was presented by Ayn Rand, and as it continues to be presented by many of her self-styled followers. Currently, when I'm asked that question, I reply that I'm an objectivist in the broad sense, but not in the narrow sense. In the broad sense, in that I agree with the fundamental premises and the attitude toward life that the philosophy of objectivism entails. But not in the narrow sense, because I do not believe that this binds me to accept any particular philosophical position that Ayn Rand or any one of her followers would espouse. And also, not in the narrow sense, in terms of the fact that I don't accept many of the frankly personal and stylistic idiosyncrasies that characterized Ayn Rand herself and the Objectivist movement. I will not go into the particular idiosyncrasies here, but I would encourage anyone who is interested to read an excellent new biography of Ayn Rand by Anne C. Heller called Ayn Rand and the World She Made. So what are the more general weaknesses of the philosophy of objectivism? One weakness that I have observed in studying the history of objectivism from its early beginnings to the present is a tendency toward dogmatism, insularity, and intolerance. The willingness to ostracize anyone who dissents from the philosophy, either fundamentally or in any peripheral statement on which Ayn Rand or Leonard Peikoff, her intellectual heir, so-called intellectual heir, or other prominent objectivists have espoused in any length. So, for instance, anyone who questions to any degree a position that Ayn Rand had on abortion or intellectual property could be ostracized as not a true objectivist. And even if they say they're not an objectivist or don't consider themselves an objectivist, they could still be ostracized for being a, quote, evader, someone who has allegedly been presented with the truth but still refuses to accept it. I don't accept this characterization of dissenters as evaders. I do not think it is fruitful. I do not think it makes for productive intellectual discourse. I do not think it advances the search for truth. Because to characterize someone as an evader assumes that this other individual has a perfect glimpse into the mind of the person doing the characterizing, that this individual has had the same background, the same intellectual build-up to the particular conversation. Even if you're right and the other side is wrong, characterizing the other side as an evader presumes that you can just get away with briefly stating, oh, this is the truth, and everyone is supposed to intellectually bow down to you and accept it. Well, if this were the way the world worked, then while it would certainly be a much better world, there would be fewer errors and fallacies and atrocities that sometimes stem from errors and fallacies. Where in human history has that ever happened? It's important to be realistic in spreading true ideas and rational ideas. It's important to understand that even if you make the best possible case, or what you think is the best possible case, a well-meaning, intelligent person may still have reservations and may still want further evidence or may still disagree based on that person's unique set of experiences and concerns. And in order to really get across to that person, taking a confrontational or condemnatory stance isn't going to help matters one bit. In order to get across to that person, one needs to genuinely understand where that person is coming from. And until one actually understands that person's background and assumptions, one cannot persuade that person. One can only alienate that person by characterizing them as evasive or evil. And to be sure, there are evil people in the world. There are mass murderers, there are terrorists, there are bigoted, intolerant fanatics. But chances are, if someone is willing to have a civil intellectual discussion with you, that person is not such a one. I think, in that sense, though this is not a formal principle of objectivism, many objectivists fail to grasp the distinction between statements and ideas that can be true or false, actions that can be right or wrong, and persons that can be good or evil. They make the leap between an idea being false and the espouser of that idea being evil, which I believe is something that needs to be combated vigorously if objectivism is to have greater prominence and if the search for truth is to have greater prominence. Now, I want to say that this is not a tendency of all people who call themselves objectivists, because this is really quite a diverse set of people. On the one hand, we do have dogmatically intolerant individuals who believe that every word that Ayn Rand ever wrote must be accepted in order for one to consider oneself an objectivist, people like her self-styled intellectual heir Leonard Peikoff. On the other hand, we have individuals like David Kelly, who considers himself an open objectivist and who believes that an objectivist thinker must be a thinker first and an objectivist second. Very admirable mentality, one that recognizes that ideological systems evolve. They assimilate new ideas over time. They work out existing ideas simply by the fact that no one thinker can ever write about everything, so other thinkers have to come in and fill the gaps or maybe correct the errors in what that first thinker wrote about. So there is hope in a more open, more tolerant objectivist approach, and perhaps the recent surge in popularity in Ayn Rand's works after the recent recession, as well as in the wake of the release of the Atlas Shrugged movie, could draw more people to the philosophy that are not as interested in adhering to every word that Ayn Rand wrote, but are interested in the search for truth and the extrapolation of the general principles that she so articulately laid out. Now, one unfortunate characteristic of the objectivist movement during the past 50 years has been a lack of internal intellectual momentum. With a few exceptions, there has been scant attempt to elaborate upon the philosophy, to extend it in new directions, to integrate it with the works of other thinkers. Recently, there's been an effort to change that, and one individual whom I would like to particularly point out as spearheading that effort is Professor Edward W. Younkins. Professor Younkins has published numerous anthologies which attempt to take various scholars' views of Ayn Rand's work and related endeavors, the growth of the libertarian movement, the works of the Austrian economists such as Mises, Hayek, Murray Rothbard, the works of Aristotle, the works of classical liberal thinkers, and build bridges to understand the interrelationships among those ideas, the various ways in which they influence one another, and the various ways that they can be elaborated upon for an even more comprehensive and rich and beautiful way of approaching philosophy and approaching life in general. This is the kind of intellectual momentum that needs to be cultivated, because if Ayn Rand is right, and there is one reality, we all inhabit one reality, and in this reality, every intellectual endeavor, every idea, is related to every other idea. There is a logic to the world that we can discover. There is an absolute truth that we can pursue in various ways depending on our individual skills and the areas in which we choose to specialize. Then it follows that we should make these connections more and more often. We should not just content ourselves with what Ayn Rand wrote or with what any one person wrote. Now, another obstacle to overcome, a weakness of objectivism as it has been historically and is now in some quarters, is a kind of particularism. Once again, there is a behavioral tendency, I think in part sparked by Ayn Rand's own very insistent personality. And I'm trying to be as diplomatic as possible, but once again, I encourage you to read Anne Heller's biography to get a better understanding of what I actually mean by that. So this personality is very oriented on particularism, on particular items in one's life, symbolizing something supposedly broader. And if one does not adhere to these particular norms or behaviors or preferences, then one is somehow implicitly rejecting that broader symbolism. An excellent parody of that is a short play by Murray Rothbard titled Mozart Was a Red that I encourage you to read. Now, this is a satire, and it's somewhat disparaging of Ayn Rand and her historical close circle of followers, but it does have some historical basis in it. And while I would, as always, counsel using reason and using active evaluation of anything one reads, I think reading this play is instructive as to pitfalls that should be avoided. Now, it seems to me that objectivism can be benefited via an integration and an exploration of other modes of thought, other philosophies, and other intellectual disciplines. And there's some of this to which objectivism is already fundamentally receptive, as, for example, an integration with economics. Ayn Rand strongly endorsed the work of Ludwig von Mises, even though she would not have agreed with his methodological subjectivism or his utilitarianism. Nonetheless, she considered him to be one of the best economists alive during her time. And I think it's important to look at the works of Austrian economists as studying human action and studying the implications of policies and generally the way human societies evolve and interact internally among their constituent individuals. It's important because while it's not a normative system, it is a system of considerable explanatory power. It actually tells us, for instance, what will happen if, all other things being equal, a politician raises the minimum wage. Well, all other things being equal, there will be a rise in unemployment. A lot of other intervening factors can come about, but if the rate of unemployment falls after the enactment of the minimum wage, we know that the decline is due to something else. It's not due to there being a higher minimum wage. Other philosophies with which objectivism can be integrated, or at least the relationships can be explored, are classical liberalism, the thoughts of Enlightenment philosophers, such as John Locke, Denis Diderot, François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire, and classical economists, Adam Smith, Frédéric Bastiat, David Ricardo. I would say none of these thinkers is right 100% of the time on 100% of the issues. But there is so much wisdom and there is so much beauty in what they have written that to miss all of that simply because one thinks that a particular philosophy has more truth in it would be regrettable. Another philosophy with which objectivism should be integrated is transhumanism, the desire to essentially transcend human bodily limitations, including limitations on our lifespan, through the use of technology and science. This is a new way of using reason to radically transform the human condition. And it has precedent throughout all of history. Throughout history, human life expectancy has risen dramatically, and there have been numerous technological interventions, including medical interventions, that have been responsible. On the other hand, many objectivists still believe that the finitude of life is somehow needed to give it closure, or that without death, life can have no meaning because one needs to be constantly making an affirmative choice between life and death. And to that I will say that if it really is the case, as the objectivist ethic states, that the fundamental choice of a human being is between life and death, and that it is a virtue to be consistent in making one's choices, as objectivism prides itself on logical consistency, then it is certainly consistent to choose life consistently over death, which means if death is unacceptable to me right now in my present state, then it would mean that death should be unacceptable to me always. And in particular, if science and technology are able to preserve my bodily integrity and my biological youth indefinitely, as scientists such as Aubrey de Grey and Ray Kurzweil predict will happen in the lifetimes of many who are alive today. This is, I think, a great way to make objectivism a cutting-edge philosophy, a philosophy that not only attempts to interpret or rationalize the way things currently are, or accept the current order or disorder, in fact, of the world as somehow natural and normal and good, but rather a philosophy that attempts to break out of those limitations. In many ways, objectivism already tries to do that in its radical insistence on individual freedom, and on productivity and the use of the mind, and on its rejection of conformity and complacency and collectivism in favor of individualism, individual rights, and technological progress, at least within the scope that most objectivists today analyze it. If we break out of the more fundamental limitations of human involuntary mortality, it does not eliminate the fact that we have chosen to do so, that we still affirmatively choose life over death. I do not think the necessity for that affirmative choice at some level, however remote to our everyday experience, will ever go away, because these interventions to achieve indefinite human life will be deliberate and technology-driven, and driven by human logic and reason and their continual application. And one other group of people who could really improve objectivism are innovative objectivists. Individuals who don't care so much about strict adherence to everything that Ayn Rand wrote, but care more about the relevance of her ideas to their individual lives and individual contexts, and the ways in which her ideas can interact with the ideas of others in order to perpetuate the search for truth. Once again, in the words of David Kelly, an objectivist thinker must be a thinker first and an objectivist second. Thank you very much. I hope that this has laid out my position with regard to objectivism, both in its strengths and in its weaknesses, as well as outlined possibilities for improvement and reasons to be hopeful with regard to the future of this philosophy.